The banking app glowed up at me from the desk, and there it was, the final verdict on 6 years of marriage. $87.36. I blinked, but the number didn't change. It just sat there, a cold little digit with a decimal point like the period at the end of everything. My thumb hovered over the screen, frozen, as if the tiny muscles had forgotten how to move. Beyond the study door, the voices rose and fell like a tide I'd been drowning in for years, and I could feel the familiar weight settling into my chest, the weight of knowing that once again, my life was about to be dismantled by someone else's choices. They're not bluffing, Nathan. They said they'll come to the store, they'll put my pictures everywhere, my face, my address, my phone number, everyone will see. My boss will fire me, my friends will never speak to me again. Lily's voice shredded through the apartment, shrill and wet and engineered to pierce. I knew the rhythm of it the way a war surgeon knows the whistle of incoming shells. It had been the soundtrack of my life for 6 years now. I could picture her exactly, pacing the living room in that frantic, bird-like way of hers, mascara streaking down her cheeks in theatrical rivulets, her hands fluttering at her throat. She had perfected the art of desperation. She had monetized it. $45,000. Lily. Nathan's voice was something between a growl and a sob. There was a sudden crash, a fist meeting drywall, or maybe a lamp going over. I flinched despite myself. 10 days ago I handed you $38,000. I emptied our bank account. You looked me in the eye, you held my hands, and you swore it was over. You swore on Mom and Dad's grave. You said you were done. You said you'd get help. I was done. I was. But then they called me, and they said one more time, just one more, and I could win it all back. You went back to the tables. His voice broke open, raw and jagged. After everything. After Mom cried for 3 days straight. After the loan shark spray-painted our front door. After your brother nearly lost his goddamn mind trying to save you. Something else shattered, glass this time, by the sound of it. You gambled again, Lily. You gambled away money you don't have, again, and now you want me to save you. Again. I didn't move from the desk chair. The study was dim, lit only by the desk lamp and the sickly orange glow of the city seeping through the blinds. Outside, the skyline was smearing itself into dusk, gray towers sinking into a bruise-colored sky, the lights of downtown flickering on one by one like 1,000 indifferent eyes. I watched a plane trace a slow, silent arc toward the airport and wondered what it would feel like to be on it, to be anywhere but here. 10 days ago, Nathan had taken the $38,000 without a word. I discovered it on a Tuesday afternoon when the electric bill bounced and I'd logged into our joint account to see what had gone wrong. The balance had stared back at me like a wound, a 5-figure sum reduced to 4, our 5 years of scrimping and saving gutted in a single transaction. He'd come home that night and knelt on the floor in front of me, his knees cracking against the hardwood, his hands clutching mine so hard my knuckles ached for hours afterward. His eyes were red and wet and desperate in a way that had once moved me but now only made me tired. She was going to hurt herself, Viv. They were at her door. They had weapons. I had to. Please, please, you have to understand. His voice had cracked on every other word. This is the last time. I swear on my life, this is the last time. I had looked at him, this man I had loved for 8 years, married for 6, and I had thought about all the things his last time had already cost us. The vacations we'd canceled, the dinners we'd skipped, the children we'd decided not to have because we could never seem to get ahead. The little house with the yellow kitchen I'd been sketching in my head since our wedding day, its walls growing fainter with every passing year. And I'd said, very quietly, "This is the last time, Nathan." Now the same scene was playing out again, and the number had swollen from 38 to 45,000, and the deadline had shrunk from soon to midnight tonight, and I was sitting in this chair with a phone that held $87.36. The math of our marriage, laid bare in black and white. The study door flew open so hard it slammed against the wall. Nathan burst in like a man fleeing a burning building. His shirt was untucked, the top 2 buttons torn clean off, a dark patch of sweat spreading from his collar like a stain on his soul. His hair stood up in wild tufts, and his hands, those hands that had once cupped my face so tenderly, that had slipped a wedding ring onto my finger with such trembling hope, were shaking as they raked through the mess. He smelled of panic, that sharp, metallic odor I'd come to recognize as the signature scent of our marriage, eau de desperation. Vivian, the account. He was already lunging toward me, his eyes fixed on my phone like a junkie spotting a fix. There should still be something left, right? After the 38, I remember there was over 20,000. The emergency fund. We can cover this. We can fix this. Just give me the phone. His fingers stretched toward it, and I saw the whole ugly cycle repeating itself. The grab, the assumption, the absolute, unquestioned certainty that I would hand over everything I had, no questions asked, because that was what I'd always done. That was my role in this family, the silent underwriter of other people's disasters. I slammed my palm down on the phone. The crack of skin on glass was louder than I'd intended, sharp as a gunshot in the quiet room. Nathan froze mid-reach, his hand hovering in the air between us like a bird that had flown into a window. Vivian. My name came out of his mouth cracked and uncertain. I raised my head and met his eyes. How much this time? He swallowed hard. A bead of sweat traced a slow path down his temple, along the edge of his jaw, and dripped onto his collar. 45,000. They said midnight, Viv. Not tomorrow, not next week, midnight tonight. If they don't get the money, they're going to her workplace, they're going to send those pictures to every contact in her phone, they're going to post them online and tag everyone she's ever met. They'll destroy her. They'll destroy her completely. Sell the car, I said, my voice flat. What? You said you'd sell the car last time. And the time before that. I let the words hang in the air between us. We still have the car, Nathan. His face crumpled, guilt and shame flickering across his features like heat lightning. But the desperation was stronger than the shame. It was always stronger. He lunged for the phone again, and this time I let him take it. I sat back in my chair and watched him snatch it up, watched his trembling fingers fly across the screen, typing in my birthday, 0823, the code he'd used for everything since our first year together. It was almost touching, that he still remembered. Almost. The app loaded. I saw the screen illuminate his face from below, saw the numbers reflected in his dilated pupils. And I watched his expression go through its awful, familiar metamorphosis. First came the eager, desperate hope, the wide eyes, the parted lips, the silent prayer of a man who still believed salvation was just a bank transfer away. Then the slight frown of confusion as his brain struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. Then the slow, creeping horror as reality sank its teeth in. The color drained from his face in stages, like watching a photograph develop in reverse. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words he couldn't quite push out. What? He tilted the screen toward me, as if I might be able to explain the impossible, as if I might say it was a glitch, an error, a terrible joke. What is this? $87. $87.36. He laughed, a short, jagged, utterly humorless sound that scraped against my nerves. This can't be. Where is the rest? Vivian, where is our money? I stood up. I did it slowly, deliberately, feeling each vertebrae in my spine uncurl, feeling the full weight of every unspoken word I'd been carrying for 6 years settle onto my shoulders. I walked to the window and stood with my back to him, looking out at the city lights winking on across the darkening skyline. 10 days ago, I said, and my voice came out so steady I barely recognized it, when you transferred the $38,000 without consulting me, when you knelt on the floor and held my hands and swore on your life that it was the last time, I called James Lawrence. I had him draft some legal documents. His retainer was $5,000. Behind me, the silence was so absolute I could hear the faint hum of electricity in the walls. Yesterday, I continued, I transferred the remaining $23,000 to my mother's account. Every last cent. The phone hit the carpet with a muffled thud. For a long, suspended moment, there was only the sound of the city outside, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of traffic, and the thin, hiccuping sobs of Lily still leaking through from the living room. Then Nathan spoke, and his voice was unrecognizable. It was low and scraped raw and trembling with something that hovered between incandescent fury and absolute despair. You moved the money. Our joint account. Our savings. 5 years of our lives. 5 years of skipped vacations and canceled dinners and nights we sat at home counting pennies. You moved it. All of it. Without a single word to me. I turned to face him. And for the first time in 6 years of marriage, I let him see the full, undiluted force of everything I had been holding back. It rose up from some dark, long-sealed place inside me, a reservoir of anger and grief and bitter disappointment that I had kept locked away for the sake of peace, for the sake of being a good wife, for the sake of not making things worse. You emptied $38,000 from that account without a single word to me, I said, and my voice was quiet but it had an edge that could cut bone. You knelt on this floor, you held my hands, you looked into my eyes, and you swore on your life that it was the last time. And now, 10 days later, you burst in here and try to snatch my phone out of my hands like a thief. And you're asking me how I could do this. He opened his mouth, closed it. His throat worked, but no sound came. His hands hung at his sides, opening and closing uselessly, like the gills of a fish drowning in air. You want to talk about consultation? I took a step toward him, and the click of my heel on the hardwood was like the tick of a metronome counting down to something final. When have you ever consulted me about your sister, Nathan? The first time she overdrew her credit card by $8,000. Did you consult me then? Or did you come home with red eyes and a sad story and a, please, Viv, she's my sister? The second time, when the loan sharks showed up at our front door and spray-painted threats across the hallway, did you sit down with me and ask what I thought we should do? The third time. The fourth. The fifth. My voice was rising now, a flood I could no longer dam. Every single time, you came to me after the fact. You didn't consult me. You informed me. You presented me with a crisis and a weeping sister and the implicit threat that if I didn't open my wallet, I was a monster. And I, like a fool, I let you. Every single time. He flinched, his face collapsing into something raw and exposed. The tears were coming now, welling up in his bloodshot eyes. Vivian, this is my money too. I cut him off, and my voice cracked on the words. I worked for it. I earned it. I postponed my dreams for it. I gave up the house with the yellow kitchen. I gave up the children I wanted. I gave up Christmases with my own family because we couldn't afford the plane tickets. And I will not watch it vanish into the black hole of your sister's gambling addiction one more time. Not one more time, Nathan. Do you hear me? The living room had gone silent. I hadn't noticed exactly when Lily's crying had stopped, but now there was only a thick, swollen quiet, the kind that settles after a storm. Then, soft footsteps, and she appeared in the doorway of the study. She was a study in curated devastation, eyes artfully reddened, lower lip trembling with exquisite precision, arms wrapped around her thin frame like a wounded bird folding its wings. But beneath the performance, I could see something else, a cold, calculating watchfulness. She was scanning the room, reading the atmosphere, recalibrating her approach. This was a woman who had spent a lifetime learning exactly how to weaponize her own fragility, and she was very, very good at it. What's going on? Her voice was small, wounded, a delicate instrument tuned to maximum guilt-inducing frequency. Nathan. Vivian. What's happening? Why are you fighting? Neither of us answered. Then her gaze fell on the papers I had left on the desk, the ones James had drafted, the ones I'd been waiting to deploy for 10 days. She stepped closer, squinting at the top sheet, and I watched her face change as she read. Loan agreement. She read the words aloud, her voice climbing with each syllable. Borrower, Nathan Mitchell. Lender, Margaret Hayes. Amount, $45,000. Interest rate, 5% per annum. Term, 3 years. Her head snapped up, and the mask slipped. The wounded bird was gone, replaced by something with talons. What is this? You want my brother to sign a loan from your mother? Like he's some kind of deadbeat. Like he's a stranger off the street. Not a stranger, I said, my voice very calm. A borrower. With clear terms. And consequences. Lily's face flushed a deep, ugly crimson. The transformation was startling, the fragile flower wilting into something hard and venomous. We're family. You don't make family sign contracts. You don't charge family interest. What kind of cold, heartless family? I let the word drop into the silence like a stone into still water. I watched the ripples spread. You keep using that word, Lily. Let me tell you what family has meant to me for the past 6 years. Family has meant watching my savings vanish into your debts while you promised, every single time, that it would be the last. Family has meant lying to my friends about why I can't afford to meet them for lunch. Family has meant giving up on the house, the vacations, the children I wanted, because there was always another emergency. Another last time, another midnight deadline. I paused, and my voice dropped to a near whisper. Family has meant being the last priority in my own marriage. Every single day. Lily's face contorted. You don't get to judge me. You don't know what it's like to be me, the pressure, the shame, the shame. I tilted my head, and I felt my lips curl into something that wasn't quite a smile. You want to talk about shame, Lily? Let me tell you about shame. Shame is having to call your mother and tell her you can't come home for Christmas because you can't afford the plane ticket, for the 4th year in a row. Shame is watching your husband kneel on the floor and beg you for money to clean up a mess he had no part in making, and knowing in your bones, that you're going to give it to him because you're too weak to say no. Shame is looking in the mirror and realizing you've become a supporting character in your own life, a walking bank account, a woman whose only purpose is to absorb the disasters of people who will never, ever stop creating them. My voice was shaking now, a fine tremor I couldn't quite suppress. Don't lecture me about shame. You have no idea what that word means. Nathan made a sound low in his throat, half groan, half sob, and pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes as if he could block out the world. Vivian, please. I forced myself back to calm. I had to be calm. If I let the anger take over completely, I would lose the only weapon I had left, clarity. The 45,000, I said, my voice steadying. I can arrange it. My mother will lend it to you, Nathan, under the terms in that agreement. But there's another condition. Lily stiffened, her eyes narrowing to slits. What condition? I pulled the second document from the drawer and set it on the desk beside the first with a deliberate, almost ceremonial slowness. This is a property lien agreement. You'll put up your apartment as collateral, the one your parents left you. It's worth at least $180,000 on the current market. If you can't repay the loan, the apartment covers the debt. It's insurance. That's all. The color drained from Lily's face so completely, so instantaneously, that for a moment I thought she might actually collapse. Her skin went the color of old milk, and her hands began to shake at her sides. No. The word came out as a whisper, fragile and disbelieving. Then louder, rising to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. No. That apartment is mine. My parents left it to me. It's all I have left of them, the only thing they ever gave me. You can't, you have no right. It's been sitting there generating rental income for years, I cut in, my voice cold and precise as a scalpel. $3,000 a month, by my count. Income that you have never, not once, used to pay down a single cent of what you owe your brother. If you're so certain you'll pay back the $45,000, then the lien is just a formality. A piece of paper in a file cabinet. If you don't pay, I shrugged. Then the apartment ensures my mother doesn't lose her retirement savings. That's the deal. Take it or leave it. You're trying to steal my inheritance. Lily shrieked, her voice splintering into something feral. You've always been jealous of me. You've always resented that Nathan loves me, that he takes care of me. You want to destroy me, you want to take everything I have. She lunged. It happened so fast I barely registered it, a blur of motion, her arms swinging up, her hand drawn back, fingers curled into talons. Her face was twisted into something I'd never seen before, the pretty, fragile mask ripped away to reveal the predator underneath. For one suspended instant, I saw her clearly, not a victim, not a wounded soul, but a woman who had learned that the world would give her anything if she cried loudly enough, and who had decided that anyone who refused deserved to be punished. Nathan caught her wrist mid-swing. The slap of his palm against her forearm was loud and brutal in the quiet room. He held her there, his knuckles bone-white, his whole arm trembling with the effort of restraint. His face was a battlefield of warring emotions, shock, fury, grief, and something that looked almost like disgust. "Stop," he said, and his voice was barely recognizable. It was low and dangerous, a voice I had never heard from him before. "Stop it, Lily. Right now. She's a monster, Nathan." Lily screamed, thrashing against his grip. "She's been waiting for this, can't you see it? She wants to destroy our family. She wants to take everything from me. Mom and Dad would hate her, they would hate you for letting her do this." Nathan flinched at the mention of their parents, and I saw the old guilt flicker across his face. For one terrible moment, I thought he would release her wrist, that the familiar pattern would reassert itself, that I would lose. Then something shifted in his expression. Some wall inside him, a wall that had stood for years, built brick by brick from guilt and obligation and misplaced loyalty, finally crumbled. And what was left behind was not weakness. What was left behind was a desperate, terrible clarity. Mom and Dad, he said, his voice cracking on every word, would be ashamed of what you've become, Lily. And they would be ashamed of me for letting it go on this long. For letting you destroy everything good in my life because I was too scared to say no. Lily stopped struggling. She stared at him with wide, uncomprehending eyes, her mouth hanging open. I love you, Nathan said, and the tears were streaming down his face now. You're my sister. You'll always be my sister. But I have been destroying my life, and my wife's life, to save you from yourself. And it has never worked. It will never work. Every time I pull you out of the hole, you dig it deeper. Every single time. He released her wrist, and she stumbled backward, clutching her arm, her face a mask of shock and betrayal. Maybe this time, you need to feel the bottom. Maybe that's the only thing that will save you. He turned away from her, turned away, for the first time in his life, and walked to the desk. His hand was shaking so badly that the pen skittered across the paper when he picked it up, leaving a jagged trail of ink like a seismograph reading of an earthquake. But he bent over the agreement, and he signed his name on the dotted line. The nib tore through the sheet in one place, carving a white scar through the black text. I pushed the red ink pad toward him. Thumbprint. He looked at me. In that look was everything: 8 years of love, 6 years of marriage, 1,000 small betrayals and a handful of great ones. His eyes held mine for a long, suspended moment, and I saw in them a grief so profound it almost broke my resolve. Almost. Then he pressed his thumb into the red ink and stamped it onto the paper. The print was dark and clear, the whorls and ridges of his skin standing out like a brand burned into the page. I took the papers, checked the signatures, and tucked them into my bag. The money will be in your account tomorrow morning, I said. James will handle the lien registration with the title office this afternoon. Lily had sunk to the floor. She sat with her back against the doorframe, her knees drawn up to her chest, her face utterly blank. She wasn't crying anymore. She had moved past crying into some silent, desolate country where even tears couldn't reach her. I walked out of the study. As I closed the door behind me, I heard Nathan begin to cry, not the controlled, performative tears he'd deployed before, but the raw, ugly, heaving sobs of a man who has just broken something inside himself that can never be fully repaired. The sound followed me down the hallway like a ghost. It followed me into the bedroom, where I lay down on the bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling. It followed me into the dark hours of the night, when I heard the front door open and close, heard Nathan's footsteps retreat down the corridor, heard the elevator ding and carry him away. I got up and walked to the window. Down in the courtyard, I could see him sitting on the bench by the lamppost. A cigarette glowed between his fingers, the first he'd lit in 3 years, ever since he'd quit because I hated the smell. The tip flared orange in the darkness, brightening and dimming, like a distress signal no one was coming to answer. I watched him smoke one cigarette, then another, then a third. He never looked up at the window. Maybe he couldn't bear to see me. Maybe he couldn't bear to be seen. I went back to bed and closed my eyes. Sleep came in ragged, dreamless fragments, the kind that leaves you more exhausted than when you lay down. Morning arrived gray and reluctant, seeping through the curtains like dirty water. I woke to sounds from the kitchen, the clatter of a pan, the sizzle of butter, the smell of eggs frying. For one fleeting, disorienting moment, I forgot everything. It could have been any ordinary morning in any ordinary marriage. Then memory crashed back in, cold and heavy as a wave, and I remembered the 45,000, the loan agreement, the lien, the sound of my husband sobbing in the study. I found Nathan at the stove, his back to me. He was still wearing yesterday's shirt, rumpled and sweat-stained, the fabric clinging to his shoulder blades. When he turned, I saw that his eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, his face haggard, the skin beneath his eyes bruised with exhaustion. He set a plate of slightly burned eggs and cold toast on the table. "Breakfast," he said, his voice hoarse as sandpaper. "Almost edible." "Probably not." We sat across from each other and ate in silence. The eggs were rubbery, the toast cold, but I chewed and swallowed mechanically, because it was something to do with my hands. The silence between us was so dense it felt like a physical presence, a third person sitting at the table. "Lily?" I asked finally. "Gone before dawn. Said she was going to try to borrow from some friends." He didn't look up from his plate. "I don't think she'll find any. But maybe that's what she needs. To not find any. The money's in your account. 45,000. He nodded. "The lien appointment is this afternoon. James is meeting us at the title office at 2. "Good." He put down his fork, and the clink of metal on ceramic was startlingly loud in the quiet kitchen. He looked at me, and I saw in his face a question he was terrified to ask. "Vivian, is there still an us? After last night, is there anything left?" I met his gaze. I owed him that much. "I don't know, Nathan. I want there to be. But I don't know how to be married to a man who will always put his sister's chaos ahead of our life together. I've tried for 6 years, and I'm empty. I have nothing left to give." "I'll change," he said, and it was the old refrain, but this time there was something different beneath it. Not the frantic, wheedling promise of a man trying to escape a difficult conversation, but something quieter. Something that sounded almost like a resolution, hard-won and fragile. "I don't know how yet. But I'll learn. I'm going to learn." I wanted to believe him. A small, stubborn part of me even did. But I had heard these words too many times, and I had learned that hope was a dangerous thing. "We'll see," I said. That afternoon, I didn't go to the title office. I told Nathan I had work to catch up on, which was true enough. But the real reason was that I couldn't bear to watch Lily sign away her inheritance. I couldn't bear to stand in that sterile government office and watch the hatred burn in her eyes while she pressed her thumb to the paper. I knew in my bones, that I was doing the right thing. But knowing it and feeling it are different animals, and I was too tired to wrestle with both. I cleaned the apartment instead. I scrubbed the kitchen counters until they gleamed. I reorganized the bookshelf by color, then by author, then back again. I refolded every towel in the linen closet into perfect, crisp squares. My hands needed something to do while my mind churned through everything that had happened, and the mindless physical labor was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. My phone rang at 4:15. Sophie Collins, my best friend since college. I almost didn't answer. I wasn't in the mood for conversation, but something made me pick up. "Vivian." Sophie's voice was urgent, carefully controlled in the way it always was when she had bad news. Sophie was a master of the calm before the storm delivery. "Have you heard about Nathan's mother?" The towel I was holding slipped from my fingers and pooled on the floor. "What about Dorothy?" "She had a massive heart attack yesterday afternoon. She's in the cardiac ICU at City General." "Nathan didn't tell you?" The silence that followed stretched out like a wire pulled to its breaking point. I felt something cold and heavy settle into my stomach, a stone of dread that seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. "No," I said, and the word tasted like ash. "No, he didn't tell me." I hung up and called Nathan immediately. The phone rang once, twice, 6 times, 8. I was about to hang up and drive straight to the hospital when he finally answered. Vivian. His voice was cautious, guarded. We just finished at the title office. Lily and I are grabbing a late lunch. Everything went fine, the paperwork is all. Your mother is in the cardiac ICU with a heart attack, and you didn't tell me. My voice was ice water, so cold it burned. The pause on his end was so long I thought the call had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice was very small. I didn't want to worry you. The doctor said she's stable now. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow. I was going to tell you tonight, when I got home. You were going to tell me tonight. I repeated the words back to him, and I could hear the disbelief in my own voice. Your mother could have died, Nathan. She could have died, and I would have found out from my best friend, because my husband, the man who promised to share his life with me, decided I didn't need to know. Vivian. Tell me the room number. Now. He gave it to me, his voice barely audible. I hung up before he could say anything else and was out the door before I could draw another breath. The hospital smelled the way hospitals always do, antiseptic and wilted flowers and the faint, sweet, terrible undertone of fear. I had spent too much time in hospitals in recent years, first my father-in-law's final illness, then Lily's various episodes, and now this. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as I walked the long corridor to the room at the end, my heels clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm that matched my accelerating heartbeat. The door was slightly ajar. I could hear voices inside before I pushed it open. The surgery alone is going to cost $15,000, even with insurance. Where are we supposed to find that kind of money, Nathan? Your wife already cleaned out the bank accounts and made you sign a predatory loan from her mother. She's not going to help. She's never going to help. She doesn't care about this family. Lily's voice, sharp and accusatory, dripping with venom. I'll figure it out. Nathan's voice, flattened by exhaustion. I always figure it out. Figure it out how? Sell a kidney. She's made it perfectly clear where we stand. We're not her family. We never were. She's just been waiting for an excuse to. I pushed the door open. The room went absolutely still, like a tableau frozen in ice. Lily, standing by the window with her arms crossed, whirled around, her face cycling through surprise, guilt, and then a fresh wave of fury. Nathan, slumped in the chair beside the hospital bed, went rigid, his spine snapping straight. And in the bed, propped against a mountain of white pillows, was Dorothy. She looked so small. That was my first thought. Dorothy Mitchell had always seemed larger than life to me, a tall, vibrant woman with a laugh that could fill a room and hands that were never still. Now she was diminished, her skin the color of old ash, her lips pale and cracked, an oxygen tube resting beneath her nose. The monitors behind her beeped a slow, steady rhythm, the metronome of a life hanging in the balance. But her eyes were still sharp and clear. And when they landed on me, they filled with a relief so profound it nearly brought me to my knees. Mom. I walked to the bed and took her hand. It was cold and papery, the veins standing out like blue rivers on a faded map. I could feel the delicate bones beneath the skin, fragile as bird wings. How are you feeling? She squeezed my fingers, weakly but deliberately. Better now, she whispered, her voice barely a breath. Better now that you're here, sweetheart. I turned to Nathan, and the look on my face made him shrink back in his chair. When were you planning to tell me, Nathan? After the surgery. After the funeral. At what point did you decide that your mother's near-fatal heart attack was information your wife didn't need? He flinched as if I'd struck him. It happened yesterday afternoon, Viv. You were dealing with the loan, the papers, the lien. You were so angry, and I didn't want to add more to your plate. I was trying to protect you. Protect me. I stared at him, and I felt the last frayed threads of my patience snap one by one, like the strings of an over-tightened violin. You weren't protecting me, Nathan. You were protecting yourself. You didn't want to have another hard conversation. You didn't want to face me. So you decided that I didn't deserve to know that the woman who has been more of a mother to me than my own was lying in a hospital bed fighting for her life. He looked down at the floor, his shoulders slumping. I know I should have told you. I was wrong. Wrong doesn't begin to cover it. I turned back to Dorothy, forcing my voice to soften. How much is the surgery going to cost? Out of pocket. About 15,000, Nathan said quietly, still not meeting my eyes. I have 5,000 in my personal savings, I said. I'll lend it to you. You'll need to sign a promissory note, same as before. Lily made a sharp, disgusted sound from her corner by the window. Another loan. Another promissory note. Everything is a transaction with you, isn't it? You can't just help. You can't just be generous. Everything has to be documented and interest-bearing, Anne. Yes, I said, turning to face her, and my voice was so cold it could have frozen the air between us. It is. Everything is a transaction now. Because I've learned, through years of painful experience, that if I don't protect myself, no one else will. I learned that from you, Lily. You taught me that lesson. You should be proud. She opened her mouth to fire back, her face contorting with rage, but Dorothy spoke first. Her voice was frail, barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a blade through silk. Lily. Enough. The room fell silent. Even the monitors seemed to pause for a moment. Dorothy turned her head on the pillow, her eyes finding her daughter. Vivian is right. She has every right to protect herself. After everything this family has put her through, after everything you have put her through, she has more right than anyone. She paused, drawing a shallow breath. If you can't see that, then you're blinder than I thought. Lily looked away, her jaw clamped so tight I could see the muscles jumping beneath her skin. Nathan stared at the floor, his hands hanging limp between his knees. And I stood there, holding Dorothy's hand, feeling something fundamental shift inside me, some last, stubborn hope that this family could ever be whole, crumbling quietly into dust. I took 2 weeks of leave from work to care for Dorothy after the surgery. My boss was not pleased. It was my 3rd extended leave in 2 years, and I could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the tally marks being added to some internal spreadsheet of my reliability. But he granted the leave anyway, and I didn't care enough to worry about the consequences. I rented a small apartment near the hospital, a studio with a kitchenette and a view of the parking garage. I spent my days at Dorothy's bedside, learning the rhythms of post-operative care, medication schedules and physical therapy exercises, the careful monitoring of vitals, the slow, painstaking return of strength to a body that had been pushed to its limit. She was a good patient, stoic and cooperative, with flashes of the wry humor I had always loved in her. Nathan came in the evenings after work. He would sit in the chair by the window, still in his office clothes, and we would exchange updates in careful, measured tones. We talked about Dorothy's recovery, about the mortgage payments, about the logistics of the lien and the repayment schedule. We didn't talk about us. There was no us left to talk about, just 2 people who had once been married, circling each other in the quiet of a hospital room. The surgery was successful. Dorothy was discharged after 10 days, and I returned to work with a strange, hollow feeling in my chest. Relief, certainly, but also a sense of something ending. I wasn't sure what, exactly. I only knew that the ground beneath my feet had shifted, and I wasn't sure where I was standing anymore. A few days after Dorothy went home, Sophie called again. I could tell from the first syllable that she had bad news. Sophie always got unnaturally calm when she had bad news, her voice dropping into a careful, measured register, as if she were handling something explosive. I saw Nathan today, she said. At the Galleria, on 5th Avenue. He was with a woman. My hand tightened on the phone until my knuckles ached. What kind of woman? Blonde, early 30s. Very polished. Designer suit, expensive bag, one of those bags that costs more than my rent. They were at the jewelry counter, and she was trying on rings, and she kept holding her hand out for him to admire. And then, Sophie paused, and I could hear her reluctance in the silence. Then she hooked her arm through his. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. I closed my eyes. The world tilted, then righted itself. Did they see you? No. I was across the atrium, behind a pillar. But Vivian, I'm sorry. I thought you should know. I couldn't not tell you. Thank you, I said, and my voice sounded like it belonged to someone else entirely. Someone calmer, someone less shattered. I'll handle it. I didn't confront him that night. I was too exhausted, too wrung out from weeks of hospital vigils and emotional combat. But I waited. I waited until Saturday, when he told me he had to go into the office for an urgent meeting. I didn't believe him. I had stopped believing him about a lot of things, but I didn't argue. I let him leave, and then I got in my car and drove to the Galleria. I found them at a cafe on the 3rd floor, overlooking the central atrium. They were at a corner table, leaning toward each other, laughing about something. The woman was exactly as Sophie had described. Sleek blonde hair swept back from a face that had never known a moment's financial worry, a cream-colored silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly salary, a string of pearls at her throat that glowed softly in the afternoon light. She had the kind of effortless elegance that comes from a lifetime of doors opening automatically, of problems being solved by other people, of never having to count pennies or defer dreams. And Nathan was looking at her with an expression I recognized. It was the same expression he'd worn when we first started dating, back when I was 24 and believed that love was enough to conquer anything. Attentive. Charming. Eager to please. The expression of a man who desperately wanted to be liked, who would shape himself into whatever form was required to earn approval. She reached across the table and touched his wrist, laughing at something he'd said. He smiled back at her, and the smile was warm and open and utterly, devastatingly familiar. I didn't make a scene. I wasn't going to give either of them the satisfaction. I turned and walked away, my heels clicking against the marble floor, and I didn't look back. I went home and waited. He came back at 8 o'clock, carrying a small white pastry box tied with string. I brought you tiramisu, he said, smiling. Your favorite. From that little Italian place you love on Mercer Street. I was sitting on the sofa, my hands folded in my lap. The apartment was dark except for a single lamp, and I could see the confusion flicker across his face as he registered the atmosphere. How was your meeting? I asked. Fine. Routine stuff. Budget reviews for next quarter. He set the pastry box on the coffee table and began loosening his tie. How was your day? Educational, I said. I went to the Galleria this afternoon. I saw you at the cafe on the 3rd floor. You were with a blonde woman. She was very beautiful. You were laughing together. She had her hand on your wrist. The smile froze on his face. Then it crumbled, piece by piece, until what was left was something raw and exposed. The pastry box sat on the coffee table between us like a tiny white coffin. Vivian, I can explain. His voice was already rising, already shifting into the defensive register I knew so well. Start with her name. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. Rachel Sterling. She's a client. We're trying to land her account. It's a huge deal, Viv. It could mean a promotion to director, a real promotion with a real salary bump. I was just being friendly. That's all it was. Business. Business that involves jewelry shopping. Business that involves another woman draping herself all over you in public. Business that you lied to me about. My voice was very calm, very measured, the calm of someone standing in the eye of a hurricane, watching the walls of wind circle closer. You told me you were at the office. You looked me in the eye this morning and you lied. She's interested in me. I know that. I've always known that. He was pacing now, his hands raking through his hair. But I never encouraged it. I swear to God, Viv, I never crossed any lines. I was just trying to keep the account. I thought if I got the promotion, I could pay your mother back faster. I could fix things between us. I was doing it for us. I stood up, and the movement was so sudden he stopped pacing mid-stride. By flirting with another woman. By lying to me about where you were. By letting her put her hands on you and smiling while she did it. That's your definition of for us. Nothing happened. Nothing. Something happened, Nathan. You spent an afternoon with a woman who is clearly interested in you. You went jewelry shopping with her. You let her touch you. And then you came home and lied to me about it. I walked past him toward the bedroom, but I stopped in the doorway and turned back. You didn't just lie to me today. You've been lying to me for weeks, ever since Sophie first saw you together. Every time I asked if something was wrong, every time I asked if there was anything you needed to tell me, you looked me in the eye and said no. And I believed you, because I wanted to believe you. Because believing you was easier than facing the truth. Vivian, please. He caught my arm, his grip desperate, his eyes wild with panic. I love you. I have always loved you. Everything I've done, even the stupid, unforgivable things, was because I was trying to make it all right. The debts. The house. Us. I was drowning, and I grabbed at anything that looked like a lifeline. But I never stopped loving you. Not for a single second. I looked at his hand on my arm. Then I looked at his face. And I felt something inside me go very still and very clear, the kind of clarity that comes only when the last hope has been extinguished. Nathan, I said quietly, you have spent our entire marriage trying to fix everything for everyone except me. You've twisted yourself into knots for Lily, for your clients, for anyone who asked. And the one person who never asked for anything, the one person who just wanted to be your partner, your equal, your wife, you took for granted. Every single time. You didn't just take me for granted, Nathan. You made me invisible. He let go of my arm. His hand dropped to his side, limp and useless. I don't trust you anymore, I said. I don't trust you to put me first. I don't trust you to tell me the truth. I don't trust you to protect our marriage. And I don't know if a marriage can survive without trust. I don't think it can. I went into the bedroom and closed the door. I didn't lock it. That would have felt too final, too theatrical. But I didn't open it again that night, and when I heard him leave the apartment an hour later, I didn't go to the window to watch him go. The next morning, I called James Lawrence and asked him to draft a divorce agreement. When I set the papers on the kitchen table that evening, Nathan looked at them for a long, long time. The silence stretched out between us, dense and heavy as a physical weight. I watched his eyes track across the text, the division of assets, the allocation of debts, the clean, surgical dissection of a life we had built together. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet. "You're leaving me?" "Yes." "Is there anything I can do?" "Anything at all. Anything you haven't already asked me to do?" I considered the question carefully. I owed him that much, a careful, honest answer. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe, someday. But not right now. Right now, I need to leave. I need to be on my own. I need to remember who I am when I'm not drowning in your family's crises, when I'm not competing with your sister for a place in my own marriage, when I'm not wondering whether my husband is with a client or with another woman. I need to find myself again, Nathan. And I can't do that here." He nodded slowly, as if he understood. I'm not sure he did, not fully. How could he, when he had never once in our marriage been the one left behind? But he didn't argue. He didn't beg. He just picked up the pen and signed his name on the dotted line, his hand shaking so badly the signature was barely legible, but his jaw set with a determination I hadn't seen before. "I'm going to change," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know you don't believe me. I know I've said it 100 times. But this time, I'm going to prove it. Even if it takes years. Even if you never come back. I'm going to become someone who deserves you." I took the signed papers and put them in my bag. "I hope you do, Nathan. For your sake. Not for mine." I moved out that weekend. Sophie helped me pack. She showed up at 8 in the morning with coffee in boxes and a grim, determined expression that brooked no argument. I spent the first month on her pull-out couch, staring at the ceiling at night and replaying every moment of the past 6 years in my head. The good ones, and there had been good ones once. The way he proposed on the Brooklyn Bridge at sunset, the way he'd held my hand through my father's funeral, the lazy Sunday mornings when we'd stayed in bed until noon and talked about nothing and everything. And the bad ones, which had eventually, inexorably, swallowed everything else. Work became my refuge. I threw myself into a project no one else wanted, a complicated, sprawling account that had chewed up and spat out 2 other project managers. I worked late nights and early mornings, survived on coffee and sheer stubbornness, and when I presented the final deliverable, the client was so impressed they asked for me by name on their next contract. My boss gave me a promotion and a significant raise. For the first time in years, I had money in my bank account that was entirely, indisputably mine. No one could touch it. No one could drain it. No one could use it to bail out a gambler or pay off a loan shark or cover a surgery I hadn't been told about. Nathan didn't vanish from my life entirely. He sent updates, mostly practical ones, mortgage payments, asset division, the progress of his repayment schedule. But sometimes he sent other things too. A photograph of Dorothy, healthy again, beaming in a sequin dress at her senior center dance night. A screenshot of Lily's Employee of the Month certificate from the boutique where she was now working full-time. A short message that said, simply, "I'm in therapy. Twice a week. It's helping." I didn't reply to most of them. But I read every single one. 6 months after the divorce was final, Lily called me. I almost didn't answer. I saw her name on the screen and felt my stomach clench with a familiar, reflexive dread. But something made me pick up. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe just a stubborn refusal to keep running from the people who had once hurt me. Her voice was different. That was the first thing I noticed. Steadier, less breathy, without that manipulative, warbling quaver I'd come to know so well. She asked if we could meet for coffee, and I said yes before I could talk myself out of it. We sat in a small cafe near my new apartment, a bright, airy place with exposed brick walls and potted plants hanging from the ceiling. She was thinner than I remembered, but in a healthy way, and she was dressed simply, jeans, a white blouse, minimal makeup. She looked like a person who had stopped performing and started living. I was a parasite, she said, staring into her coffee cup as if the foam could tell her future. I know that now. I used my brother. I used you. I told myself it was okay because we were family, because I was in pain, because the world owed me something. But it wasn't okay. None of it was okay. It was just me being selfish and weak and too scared to face my own problems. She had been promoted to store manager. She was dating a good man, Leo Grant, a logistics coordinator she'd met through work, who knew about her past and had decided to love her anyway. She was paying off her debts, a portion of every paycheck, and she had started taking accounting classes at the community college. She showed me her transcript on her phone, straight A's. I'm sorry, Vivian, she said, and her eyes were clear and steady. I'm so sorry. For everything. For the money. For the lies. For the way I treated you. You didn't deserve any of it. I didn't say, it's okay, because it wasn't. The damage had been done, the marriage had ended, and no amount of apology could undo those years of slow erosion. But I said, thank you, and I meant it. And when she reached across the table and took my hand, I let her. A few months later, on my 32nd birthday, I woke to a bank notification. A transfer of $5,000, with a note attached, repayment number 12. Also, happy birthday. I hope you're well. N. Later that day, Dorothy called. Come to dinner, sweetheart. Just the two of us. Nathan is out of town on business. Please, I'd love to see your face. I went. She made her grandmother's apple pie, the one she taught me to bake in her warm, cluttered kitchen, back when I was a new bride who still believed in happily ever after. We sat at her kitchen table and talked for hours about everything except the divorce. She told me stories about Nathan as a boy, how he'd been the one to take care of everyone after his father died, how he'd shouldered burdens no child should ever have to carry, how he'd learned too early that his worth was measured by how much he could save others from their pain. It's not an excuse, she said, her voice fierce. I'm not making excuses for him. But it's an explanation. He never learned how to let go. He never learned that saving someone isn't the same as loving them. When I left that night, she hugged me at the door, a long, fierce embrace that smelled of cinnamon and Chanel No. 5. You'll always be my daughter, she said into my hair. No matter what happens. No matter where you go. You'll always be my daughter. I cried in the car on the way home, but they weren't entirely sad tears. They were the tears of someone who had finally, after years of feeling like an outsider, been claimed. Nathan came back from his business trip and asked if we could meet. Not at the old apartment, that would have been too painful, too loaded with ghosts. He suggested the park where we'd had our first date, a lifetime ago. It was autumn. The trees were shedding their leaves in drifts of crimson and gold, and the air had that crisp, expectant quality that makes everything feel possible. He was waiting on the bench by the pond, wearing a sweater I didn't recognize and a haircut that actually suited him. He stood when he saw me, and for a long moment we just looked at each other, Two people who had once known each other more intimately than anyone else in the world. "You look good," he said. "So do you." We sat on the bench and watched the ducks paddle across the pond, their wake spreading in perfect V's across the dark water. The silence was comfortable, or as comfortable as it could be, given everything that lay between us. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said finally. "In therapy, and on my own. About why I kept choosing Lily over you. Even when I knew it was destroying us. Even when I could see the damage I was doing. I couldn't stop. And I needed to understand why." "What did you figure out?" "That it was easier." He let out a long, unsteady breath that clouded in the autumn air. Lily's problems were dramatic and immediate. They had clear solutions: give her money, save the day, be the hero. Being a good husband was harder. It wasn't dramatic. It meant showing up every day, in quiet, unglamorous ways, without a crisis to make me feel important. It meant listening. It meant compromising. It meant putting your steady, everyday needs ahead of my own need to be needed. He looked at me, and his eyes were full of a sadness that had aged into something wiser and more rueful. "I was a coward, Vivian. I chased the easy kind of love, the kind that made me feel like a savior, and I lost the real kind. I lost you." I didn't say anything. I let his words settle into the space between us, let them sink into the cold autumn earth. "I'm not asking you to take me back," he said. "I know I don't have that right. But I wanted you to know that I understand now. I understand what I did, and I understand what it cost us. And I've been working, every single day, to become the kind of man who would never make those choices again." He reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 folded sheets of paper. The first was a bank statement showing a long series of regular transfers to my mother's account. The remaining balance was less than $2,000. The second was a detailed ledger of every payment Lily had made since she started working, dates, amounts, running totals. Between them, they had repaid nearly $60,000. "I'm proud of her," I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. "She wants to be someone you could respect," Nathan said quietly. "We both do." The sun was sinking low, gilding the pond in shades of amber and rose. A breeze stirred the fallen leaves around our feet, sending them skittering across the path. I pulled my jacket tighter and made a decision I hadn't known I was ready to make. "Nathan," I said, "I've spent the past year learning how to be alone. It's been hard. Some nights it's been almost impossibly hard. But it's also been good. I've rebuilt myself from the ground up. I have an apartment that's mine, a career that's mine, a life that belongs to no one but me. And no one can take that away." He nodded, his jaw tight. I could see him bracing himself for the rejection he clearly expected. "But I've also learned," I continued, "that holding on to anger forever is its own kind of prison. I've been living in that prison for a long time. I don't want to live there anymore. And I don't want you to live there either." I turned to face him fully. "I'm not saying we can go back to the way things were. That marriage is dead. It died a long time before we signed the papers. But maybe we can start something new. Something smaller. Something honest. Something built on the people we are now, not the people we used to be." The smile that broke across his face was like sunrise after a very long night, tentative at first, then spreading, then radiant. "So if you want to take me to dinner sometime," I said, "I might say yes." "I would like that," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I would like that more than anything in the world." We sat on the bench until the stars came out, and the city lights reflected off the pond like a scatter of diamonds on black velvet. Then he walked me to my car, and I drove home alone, but not lonely. There was a lightness in my chest I hadn't felt in years, a sense that something long broken was finally beginning to heal. That was 3 months ago. We've been on 6 dates since then. They've been awkward and sweet and sometimes a little sad. We talk about things we never talked about in 6 years of marriage, our fears, our failures, the specific, precise ways we wounded each other. It's not always comfortable. Sometimes it feels like walking through a minefield with a flashlight. But it's real. It's the most real thing we've ever had. Last week, Nathan brought me to Dorothy's for Sunday dinner. Lily was there with Leo, and she handed me a jar of homemade strawberry jam and a card. The card said, in her neat, careful handwriting, "Thank you for not giving up on my brother. And thank you for not giving up on me. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of this second chance." After dinner, Dorothy pulled me aside in the kitchen while the others were clearing the table. "I've been praying for this," she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Not that you get back together, that's your choice, and whatever you decide, I'll support it with my whole heart. But that you'd both find peace. Real peace. And it looks like maybe you have." I hugged her, and I realized she was right. Peace had arrived, not with a bang but with a slow, quiet unfurling, like the first green shoots pushing through burned earth. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe Nathan and I will find our way back to each other, slowly and carefully, building something new on the ruins of the old. Maybe we'll discover that we're better as friends than as partners, that some things, once broken, are meant to stay broken. Either way, I am not the woman I was 2 years ago. That woman, the one who gave until there was nothing left, who mistook self-sacrifice for love, who let her boundaries dissolve in the name of family, is gone. In her place is someone new. Someone who has learned that love is not the same as endless giving. Someone who has learned that protecting yourself is not the same as being selfish. Someone who has learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do, for yourself, and for everyone else, is to say, enough, and mean it. Nathan is learning to be the man he should have been all along. Lily is learning to stand on her own 2 feet, without her brother as a crutch. And I have learned that I am stronger than I ever knew, and that rebuilding a life from rubble is possible if you're willing to do the work. The balance on my banking app isn't $87 anymore. It's not a fortune, not yet, but it's growing. And every cent of it is mine. Earned by my own hands. Guarded by my own boundaries. A testament to the woman I've become. That, I've come to understand, is worth more than all the promises in the world.